In the last few lecture modules, we've been focusing on that first step in identifying, extracting, and possibly evaluating an argument. That step of identifying whether or not a bit of spoken or written language contains an argument. Now we want to turn our attention towards the second step, and we want to keep in mind our overarching goal in this project and refine it now a little bit in light of this second step. Our overarching goal here is to take a passage, determine whether or not it contains an argument. Then, if it does, we want to be able to develop a sympathetic formulation of that argument that maximizes its comprehensibility, its rigor, and its impact. And we'll do this in this second step by creating what's called a standard form version of that argument. And to do that, we'll follow 4 basic steps. Once we've identified that passage, that written or spoken passage as containing an argument, then we'll identify the premises and the conclusion of the argument, determine what the conclusion is and what the premises are. We'll then rephrase the argument to make the structure apparent. We'll make sure that every time a particular bit of content is used in the argument, we use the same phrases. We'll put the premises first in the order that makes the most sense and the conclusion last. We'll eliminate any extraneous material, that is, elements of the original argument that don't actually facilitate establishing the truth or likely truth of the conclusion. And we'll provide any missing elements, that is, things that connect content, phrases, or ideas in the argument so that it's clearer or more straightforward how the premises establish the truth or likely truth of the conclusion. So we'll go through each of these steps in a row now. Once we've identified that a written or spoken passage contains an argument, our first step is going to be to identify which elements of that passage are premises and which is the conclusion. Now, there are 2 bits of information that can help us out. On the one hand, those premise and conclusion indicators. Those can help. They can tell us which parts of a passage are premises, which part are the conclusion, if they're there. Oftentimes, they may not be. And so it'll be important for us to not just use that information exclusively, but to make sure that we understand the passage, that we think we have a good handle on what it is the person is trying to establish and what it is that they're citing in order to establish that. The premises will always be our evidence, the things that someone is citing. The conclusion will always be what they seem to want to establish as true or likely to be true. Once we've determined which elements of our spoken or written passage are premises and which is the conclusion, we'll want to put the argument into standard form. We'll put all of the premises first and the conclusion last. We'll make sure that we put the premises in the order that makes sense, that allows the reader with as minimal an effort as possible to see the connections between the individual content elements, to make each step on our stepping stone bridge from premise to conclusion as easy and straightforward as possible. We'll want to use the same phrases to refer to the same content elements. So if we have a statement as an antecedent and a conditional, and it's also by itself, the exact same phrasing should be used in each instance of that statement. If we have an argument that's about banks in one premise, then we want to use bank to refer to financial institution consistently throughout. We don't want to use bank to refer to sharp turn at some point. So the same content phrases used in the same sense, premises ordered in a way that makes the relationships as clear as possible. All of the premises first and the conclusion last. And that will give us our standard form version of the argument. Now, we still aren't quite done yet. We also want to go through now and see if there's any extraneous material. That is there anything that really doesn't help to establish the truth of the conclusion or the likelihood of the conclusion? We want to make sure that we make the argument as focused and concise as possible. If an element of the passage doesn't contribute to establishing the truth of the conclusion or the likelihood of the conclusion, then we might want to consider eliminating it. But we have to be careful here. We don't want to eliminate something that actually plays an important role. And so I would suggest that when you're going through thinking about, do I get rid of something, that you exercise caution and that you adopt the approach that if an element is common knowledge, or when it uses words or ideas that are used in other statements in that argument, the premises or the conclusion, that you be very careful to make sure that it doesn't actually establish some important connection between ideas in the argument before you eliminate it. One example of eliminating material that's actually important but may seem extraneous to people is when students will oftentimes eliminate information about sources, the authors, for example, or sources of data. Whenever somebody introduces something and cites a source, that source is part of the information in the argument. It helps the consumer of the argument to assess the likelihood that that bit of information is reliable or true or highly advanced. So if somebody's making an argument in economics and they cite an economist, you want to note the economist they cite. If they cite the National Bureau of Labor Statistics, you'll want to note that that's where they're getting their data. And so whenever you have citations like that, people being mentioned, organizations being mentioned, a source where that information came from, you want to keep that source in, even if it's something innocuous like people say, because by keeping that information in, you help the consumer of your argument to better assess its likelihood of being true.